Welcome to the After On podcast. I'm your host, Rob Reed, and this is a series of conversations with thinkers, founders, and scientists. Take a little time and stretch out, because these talks are unhurried and meant to bring you to a top percentile understanding of something important. So, whether you're into startups or ideas, a techie or a lit major, take your time, engage your mind, and you'll be glad you did it. Especially this week, when we'll be talking to
UCSF neuroscientist Adam Gazzaley, whose enormous and bustling lab is enlisting video games in the fight against horrible neurological conditions like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and much more. Their goal is to create games which will literally become prescription treatments to enhance or even replace traditional medicines. And they may be on the cusp of their first major success. Adam was my second guest on this show way back in the summer of 2017. Today I'm presenting a remix, an update, and partially a rerun of that original episode for two reasons. First, my original episode with Adam has always been very popular with listeners, but my audience has grown a ton since I posted it last year, and as a result, most of you haven't heard it yet. And those of you who have, mostly haven't heard it in over a year. And a lot has happened in Adam's lab during that year. So this feels like a great time to present his fascinating work to those of you who are new to it, and also to bring a robust update on that work to everyone, including myself. Roughly the first 2/3 of the episode you're about to hear is vintage, and the final third is a brand new flurry of wisdom, facts, and information from one of the top young neuroscientists on the West Coast, all recorded just a few weeks ago. Before we get started, I need to say a quick word about the company Patreon, which has stumbled into a bit of a controversy over the last few weeks. If you're not familiar with it, the Patreon site helps the general public support independent creative projects like this podcast with small monthly donations. Think of it as Kickstarter, only for ongoing or episodic work. Regular listeners will know that the support I receive through Patreon is this podcast's sole source of income. Over 1,000 people back me there, thank you one and all, and together they cover my expenses and also bring me slightly north of New York City minimum wage for the dozens of hours that I put into each of these episodes. My broader audience has been large enough to allow me to run advertising for a while now, but I haven't yet hit on an ad model that I feel is entirely consistent with the mission and the values of this show. Until I do, the show is going to remain ad-free. And without the generosity of my Patreon backers, this thing would have disappeared long, long ago. Ultimately, it turns out that not everyone's a fan of Patreon, the company. Indeed, some people have started boycotting it. The arguments surrounding all this are nuanced and politically charged. Since I haven't closely followed the various public and private debates, I'm not qualified to present its two sides to you. Particularly because this is not a political podcast in any way. Indeed, I think of it as something of a sanctuary from the partisan rancor that's been saturating our world lately. So if the Patreon controversy interests you, I suggest you Google it. And for what it's worth, my own very high-level take is that smart, well-intentioned people could quite reasonably find themselves on either side of this debate. So I certainly don't view this as a matter of good versus evil. And I'll add that it's probably quite unlikely to become an issue of mass concern. The people who care about it care very deeply for strongly idealistic reasons, and the people who don't care about it are probably very numerous. As a result of all this, several fans of the show over the past few months have sent me incredibly kind notes expressing their desire to support my work, but their aversion to Patreon, and asking me to create an alternative way for them to back me. The volume of these notes has increased a lot lately, and some of them are coming from people who are shutting down their Patreon accounts entirely, but still want a mechanism to support me. Enter the PayPal button. You can now support the After On podcast through the internet's biggest payment processor instead of Patreon. To do that, simply go to my site at after-on.com and look for the PayPal button in the upper right corner of the homepage. Click it and you can donate any amount you wish, either on a one-time basis, which for some insane reason Patreon has never supported, or on a recurring monthly basis. Now, the drawback to supporting the show this way is that PayPal does not offer the special podcast distribution tools that Patreon has developed for creators. So while I fervently wish it was otherwise, there's no scalable, or at least no sane and affordable way for me to distribute bonus content to my PayPal backers, so just bear that in mind. Now, if you find yourself at that PayPal button wondering what a reasonable donation would be, I'll note that there's a profound gravitational pull around the $5 per month level within Patreon for the simple reason that this is the amount that unlocks the extra content. But it's recently struck me that I may have been positioning Patreon and support for the show in general in terms that are a bit too transactional. Now, I do feel very good about the body of work I've been creating for backers to reward and incent support. And I deeply hope that most of them get real value from it. But I'd also like to think that many of those who back the show do it less for the bonus material and more because they simply want the show to exist. The main feed of the podcast accounts for the overwhelming majority of the work that I put into this. That's what my supporters actually fund. Not really the bonus content, although it funds that as well. The main feed is both free, and for now, it is free of ads. And it will remain cost-free for as long as there's at least some prospect that this whole project of mine might eventually become financially sane undertaking. I spend dozens of hours preparing for each and every one of my interviews, and more often than not, I cross the country, or at least a big chunk of it, to interview my guests in person. This crowds out a lot of better paying creative opportunities that come along, and I'm more than fine with that because this work is a pure joy. But at some point, its underlying financial logic has to shift if it's to continue. So please, whether you are pro-Patreon or anti-Patreon, whether you're likely to devour those extra hours of bonus content or are just unlikely to find time for it in your life, please do consider supporting the show in a non-transactive way to help it continue to exist at whatever level of support you're personally comfortable with. On Patreon, I have lots of backers who share $1 a month with me, and I appreciate them massively because they're making that gesture and they're making that sacrifice without unlocking any of my special audio. I also have backers who astound me monthly with $200 gestures of support, which does go a long way to keeping the lights on. I'll add that way north of 95% of my listeners don't support the show, and I fully respect that. If I didn't, I wouldn't be offering it for free. Beyond that, I deeply appreciate the hours that this large group puts aside for me and my guests every month because time is our most precious and least renewable resource. So to every listener, I'm honored by your attention and hope to continue to earn it. One very final note about Patreon, then we'll get started. This week's bonus content is a really cool follow-up conversation with my most recent guest, Harvard Astronomy Department Chairman Avi Loeb. Just a couple days after I posted our main interview with Avi in late November, he went ahead and released a fascinating new paper connected to this strange interstellar object known as Oumuamua. And as it turns out, he has a lot of other work in the pipeline. We recorded a sort of mini interview surveying that upcoming work, which I'll be presenting to my backers in 2 parts with part 1 running today. And with that, let's join me and Adam Gazzaley in the recent past. Then about 2/3 of the way in, will join us in the very recent past. Adam Gazzaley, thank you so much for inviting me into this gorgeous lab of yours at UCSF.
Thank you. I'm excited to have a conversation with you.
Before we talk about all the amazing things that are going on here, why don't we talk a little bit about your background, where you were born, where you grew up, what brought you down this educational path that has led here?
Sure. So I grew up in New York City, did all my training on the East Coast.
Which borough?
I have occupied 4 of the boroughs.
Whoa, which borough did you not occupy? Staten Island? How did I guess? Okay, all but Staten Island.
Born in Brooklyn, grew up in Queens, went to high school in the Bronx, and then spent my adult years in Manhattan. And that's where I went to med school and did my PhD training.
Well, you got to go back to Staten Island one of these days.
Yeah, close all 5.
Exactly. So undergrad was New York?
Undergrad was upstate New York.
Was upstate.
And then med school and grad school in neuroscience. My PhD was at Mount Sinai. And then from there, I went to Philly. I went to Penn for my residency training in neurology. From there to the West Coast. figured I'd try out what was going on out here and went to Berkeley for 3 years to learn cognitive neuroscience methodology, brain imaging, brain stimulation, those type of tools, and wound up staying here and been here for 15 years now.
Now, did you then come here to UCSF as a postdoc initially, or was that postdoc?
Yeah. So I did my postdoc at UC Berkeley. And when I started at UCSF in 2005, I started as an assistant professor. So I started my first faculty position here at UCSF.
So now you're 12 years here.
Correct.
And very big picture, tell us what you focus on, your revolving door pitch.
Yeah. So my focus has evolved a lot over the years. It used to be dedicated to understanding how the brain works and how it goes wrong in many different conditions, including healthy aging. But now my center here at UCSF called Neuroscape, our team is pretty much 100% focused on not just understanding the brain, although that's still something that we pay attention to, but how we can build new technology or leverage existing technology to improve brain function.
And this is a rather giant lab, if I'm not mistaken. How many full-timers work here?
Yeah, we have around 30 full-time people, which is pretty big for an academic group.
Yeah, seems
and
very big.
Yeah, we have 6 faculty, and with our volunteer staff, we have a very big internship program. We're around 100 people.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
100 full-time equivalent.
Yeah, so we're a big group of people all dedicated to trying to figure out how we could use technology for good to help our brains.
And now, what inspired you to pursue this particular dimension of the many dimensions of medical science?
Well, as a neurologist, I felt a great degree of frustration, as many of us do, with our treatments. We have a whole set of tools that we reach for when someone comes in complaining of the memory problem, an attention problem, depression, anxiety, all the conditions of the mind. And almost all of those tools are small molecules, what we call drugs or pharmaceuticals. The problem with them is that they are targeted to neurotransmitter systems in the brain, but they're not targeted to the underlying computational unit of the brain, which is the neural network. And so we have to boost our doses to very high levels to get the effects that we want, and then we get just as many side effects as effects. And that's just the world that we live in as physicians. And I was frustrated with that. I figured there has to be a better way of improving how our brains function than relying on these non-specific, non-personalized drugs.
Now, this is a real novice question, but I guess I didn't realize this until now. Are you saying that substantially all, or at least the overwhelming majority of drugs that people use for depression, anxiety, et cetera, strictly operate on the neurotransmitter level and none of them are actually getting into the physical dimension of the brain or the neurons?
Yeah, they act almost like as a sledgehammer, blunt. These neurotransmitters, receptors that they target are diffusely located throughout the brain.
Yeah.
And so if you want to have a certain effect, you have to bring on a large quantity of these molecules. And then you're going to induce other effects that we call side effects.
Yeah.
And they could be devastating and make the drug intolerable. And so that is a very big challenge and something for 50 years that we've been trying to build better targeted molecular treatments, and we've really failed. Now, I applaud the many scientists around the world, and many of whom are my colleagues, that are working on cures for things like Alzheimer's disease. I want that to happen, obviously. While that pathway is continuing along, we need to think out of the box about what else we can do to help improve brain function. That experience, and by that I mean how we interact in the world around us, or even the world within us, drives plasticity of the brain. The ability of our brain to modify itself at every level, its structure, its chemistry, its function, all in response to how we interact with the world.
So you can go beyond merely operating at the neurotransmitter level or the receptor site level and get into the sinews of the brain itself by leveraging neuroplasticity, and you do that by way of experiences that people undergo.
Yes, we know that experiences, unlike the drugs we use, activate the brain selectively. They activate brain networks. That's the nature of how the brain works, is that when you engage in an environment in a certain way, your brain responds selectively. And so this concept that we can use experiences to change the brain is an old one. It is the entire basis of our education system. It's the entire basis of all forms of therapy that have existed. And it's a completely non-contentious point in neuroscience that experience drives plasticity. So the foundations of the idea are very strong, that you could create an experience and lead to a positive effect. And we know that an experience could lead to a negative effect. You could go off overseas in a war and not get shrapnel in your brain, but just witness a tragic moment. And that could detrimentally impact the function of your brain for the rest of your life. We call that post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you flip that concept around, then we could create experiences that are powerful enough to lead to improvement and not negative consequences. And so that was the scientific foundation of the idea of not relying on drugs to improve attention and the other cognitive abilities that we study in the lab, but to create experiences.
And of course, the challenge with experiences is it's hard to come up with an experience that's as standardized as a molecule, an experience that's targeted, that's studyable, that's validatable, that's repeatable, etc. And therefore, you came to
video games.
Somehow I knew you were going to say that. We've known each other for a while.
Exactly.
So, yes.
We go back. But you really laid it out beautifully. The problems with therapy and that it has had is that some therapists are great and some are not so great. And some you need a small dose and some you need a bigger dose. And it's the same thing with our educational system. Teachers vary and
even if they don't vary, a particular teacher with a certain set of students is going to deliver a completely unique experience on Tuesday versus Wednesday. Even teaching the same lesson, even teaching to identical twins of the people who were in the first class, you just can't have the standardization of experience that you can have with the standardization of a molecule.
Exactly.
But a game, you're right, can replicate. Yeah.
And the other thing is that it is a non-personalized experience, right? So a teacher's speaking to a class, and we know that some students are picking up the information rapidly and they're bored now, and other kids are struggling and they're just not ever going to get there. So the other problem with a lot of the experiences is that they're not really targeted to the individual. They're not personalized. So the idea of a video game was really attractive to me because it can be delivered reproducibly through a game engine. It can be delivered in a personalized way through adaptivity, and we could talk more about that. That's one of our key features of our game development. And it can be delivered in a way that's targeted to a neural system that you want to optimize by the game mechanics. If it's an attention system that you're trying to improve, you could create a game environment, an interactive experience that challenges attention, and the brain responds selectively. And then, of course, there's that other feature of games that's hard to ignore, is that they're fun.
They are fun.
And they're engaging and they're immersive. And that is exactly what any training program should be.
I have heard that therapy is not necessarily fun.
It's not fun. And medicine is often not considered fun, but
Right.
It could be. And thus, video games had that other feature that we are horrible at in our current condition, which is compliance. That even if a drug is life-saving, people do not often take them. That's remarkable statistics.
It is
on that.
astounding, but I've heard enough statistics from enough sources to certainly accept the fact that some people, when told, take that pill and you will not die, end up watching Cheers and forget to do it.
It happens all the time. We have a very, very serious issue of compliance. And so if we have a experience that's delivered reproducibly, targeted, personalized, that's fun, and not only that, we could monitor compliance remotely. We know when someone's taking their medicine in video game format because their data goes to the cloud, to our lab, and we could get notified if they didn't take their dose or if they're trying to take too much of it.
Take their dose. I love that. Did you take your dose of the video game today? So let's talk about your first game, NeuroRacer. Why did you decide to target distracted attention with your first major creation in this field?
You always work on what you know. And when I came up with this idea of building a video game, the first target that I chose was one that I knew very well, which was distraction. I had been studying distraction, the impact of multitasking on performance for many years. We have neural markers of it. We have expertise in how to engage it. So I came about this from a neuroscience perspective. And so those abilities of resisting distraction, of being able to maintain your focus, of holding information in mind, something we call working memory, was the focus of my research for many years. They're also core to everything we do. They form essentially the base of the pyramid upon which all other cognitive abilities rest.
This is like having good core muscles or something.
Yeah,
It's useful in almost any activity.
Exactly. If you can't pay attention, your language will be affected, your decision making, your emotional regulation. You know, at every level, you will be impaired and in the real world. And so it's a really great target because it could have broad positive consequences. The other reason it's a good target is pretty much every neurological or psychiatric condition that impacts cognition. those patients have problems with attention, distraction, working memory. It's just pervasive. So again, you could affect many different populations in a positive way if you can improve those abilities.
It was a well-studied and well-understood field. It was particularly well-studied and well-understood by you. So did that mean you were coming in with the equivalent of like an IQ test for attention? Was there some scale that you were trying to bring somebody from a 3 to a 7 on?
It's a great question. So if you're going to build a game to improve these abilities, half the challenge is building a good game. And that's not trivial. The development process, you don't just build something and sprinkle some game dust on it. It's a baked-in process from the beginning. And so
I kind of got ripped off with that game dust I bought online last week.
It just doesn't work.
It said just sprinkle it on anything and it becomes fun.
Some colors and some rewards and that's
man.
it. Yes, a lot of people fell for that
I'm
game
sending
dust.
it back. I'm sending it back.
It doesn't really work. But once you have something, my view is that that's not the appropriate time to sell it and say it does what you think it should do. That's the appropriate time to do a research study.
You got to measure this.
You got to figure it out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the way it works. You need to validate. And so to validate, you need to have outcome measures that are sensitive and appropriate to document that. And so that's where we had a strong suit, is because we had been developing tests of attention and working memory, as well as the neural markers that go along with those abilities.
We meaning the forerunners to this lab.
Yeah, but UCSF.
And these were tests like flashing light and reaction tests?
Yeah, they're tests, for example, our working memory test that we've studied for many years is you sit in front of a computer, you see a face, and we ask you to remember that face. 7 seconds pass and we show you another face, probably similar face, and you have to say, is that the face or not? And sometimes we distract you during that. And sometimes we make you multitask when you're doing that. And we know that older adults, and here I'm defining that as older than 60 and healthy, no signs of Alzheimer's disease, they do very poorly on tests that have distraction and multitasking. Well documented by many labs, including ours, in dozens of papers. And so we wanted to improve that ability in older adults.
Because they're more vulnerable. The effect is already evident.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and also it is impairing their quality of life.
Yeah.
They feel distracted. They feel like they're having trouble competing in the workforce because of it. And they desperately want to be more focused.
So that's your measure. That test and others like it.
Yes.
Very, very easy to quantify. Did they remember, did they got 53% or did they get 72% of the, yeah.
And it's beyond that. It's the speed of response, which is a very sensitive indicator of how quickly they could recall these memories, even if they get it right. How fast were they able to recall it? And then there are many other measures. And what we do is during these tests, we record brain activity. Sometimes we do it with functional MRI. Sometimes we do it with EEG, which records electrical metrics of brain activity. And in this particular study, this game is called Neuroracer. First of all, we were targeting older adults because, as we said, they're a vulnerable population when it comes to memory and attention, and we felt that it would be a big win to improve it. We recorded their brain activity while they were playing Neuroracer, the game itself, but also to understand how their attention and memory was improving outside of the game. So that was what's very important about these studies, is not just to get better on the game.
When you were watching them play the game, were you in a sense saying, man, if we could get this region to light up brighter, we know we're doing better? Or in the EEG, if we could get this particular brainwave to sound a little louder, we know we're doing better? Or were you more recording that stuff so as in the future go back and get a sense of what you are looking for?
We do it after the fact. We go back and look at it.
So you didn't know yet what you were looking for.
We had a hypothesis.
You had an hypothesis.
So
yeah.
As we get older, the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, the most evolved part of the human brain, seems to diminish its ability to engage robustly when you're challenging yourself from an attentional point of view.
So you might have thought if somebody went into an MRI and there were an older adult who was suffering from these things, that part of the brain would light up less.
We have shown that.
You have shown that.
Many times.
Yeah.
We even showed it in our video game that when you play the game and you're older, you engage the front part of your brain less. So the question was, would training on the game help you engage the front part of your brain more, have it light up more? And would that lead to improvement outside of the gameplay
into
these other areas like face memory? And so that was the study design that we engaged after the year of game development of building Neuroracer.
So you were building NeuroRacer based on highly educated guesses about distraction probably is associated to these things. This is a distraction mechanic that we can have in the game. Now let's take this distraction mechanic that we've come up with and try to make it fun.
Yeah, we call them hypotheses. Our hypothesis was that because abilities like multitasking and sustained attention and working memory all relied on common brain mechanisms that use the prefrontal cortex, that if we could improve one through adaptive gameplay, in this case multitasking, we would see improvements in those other abilities that relied on similar mechanisms. That was what our hypothesis behind this experiment was.
Now, you also came away from this, or perhaps went into it, with a focus on a particular theta wave, correct?
Yeah, so there is a low frequency vibration, essentially, of electrical brain activity that's generated from the prefrontal cortex when you are paying attention, when you're trying to resist distraction, when you're holding information in mind. We call that midline frontal theta. That's the name of it. So it's coming from the frontal region of the brain in the midline, and it's theta, which is a low frequency like 6 hertz. That burst occurs in everyone's brain if I asked you to focus, if you directed your attention. But it also occurs when you're holding information in mind, when you're doing working memory. It also occurs when you're multitasking. So it was an interesting metric to us because it is common across all these different types of abilities that we call cognitive control.
And its association with this diverse set of abilities was known by others before you started doing this work. That was a
Correct.
part of the known landscape.
That was already known.
So you were intrigued by this particular theta wave.
Yeah.
And was that something then you were tracking assiduously when people were playing NeuroRacer? Were you trying to see if midline frontal theta?
Yep, correct.
Whether that went up while people were playing, or was that
This
something
was
you were
post.
tracking throughout? Is this post?
Yeah, so we have people come down to the lab, our participants, our older participants come down. We do multiple days of cognitive testing, and we record EEG activity while they're playing NeuroRacer. Then they train for a month
On NeuroRacer.
on NeuroRacer, 1 hour a day, 3 days a week for 4 weeks. Then they come back, and then we recorded brain activity again and cognitive tests and saw what improved outside of the game and what changed in their brain when they played NeuroRacer.
And you saw essentially more frontal midline theta activity at the end of the month than you saw prior.
We saw that activity was reduced in an older adult compared to a 20-year-old on day one, and afterwards it was indistinguishable from a 20-year-old.
My metaphorical brain is saying, so in a sense, you kind of created a gym, but instead of working the bicep, it was working this frontal midline theta muscle. That muscle strengthened over the course of a month of workouts. And it seems that this muscle is used in a diversity of activities. Now that it's been bulked up through this training, that muscle is available not merely when somebody's playing NeuroRacer, but when they're doing a diversity of things that have to do with working memory, attention, etc.
That's our interpretation.
That's the interpretation.
So we see that change occur. We also saw that working memory and sustained attention also improved in these older adults.
And those are things that are associated with frontal midline theta.
And we showed those people that showed the biggest change in their midline frontal theta, we showed that they were also the people that showed the most improvement on the attention task.
So there's correlation and amplitude.
So we correlated
it.
And so that's how we mechanistically connect what we found in the brain with what we found in improved abilities outside of the game.
That's amazing. Now, that's the kind of thing that I would imagine might end up on the cover of a magazine. And it did, didn't it?
It did.
Leading question. Yes. We go back a ways. I know the answer to this.
Yeah. So it's one of those life highlights because it was a 5-year study. At one point, there were 50 people on our team involved in data collection.
Wow.
It took us a year to build this game, working with friends of mine that worked at LucasArts. So a year of development, building NeuroRacer, and then multiple studies. And eventually, in September of 2013, it was published as the cover story in Nature, which, is, as a scientist, it's as good as it gets.
It is as good as it gets.
Probably the most painful thing is that I probably won't have another cover of Nature in my life.
Well, maybe you'll be on the cover of Science, which is almost
possible.
as good, right? So we've mentioned various tools of your trade. I'd like to just talk briefly about MRI, EEG, and TACS or TMS. So MRI is probably something that people are most familiar with. What most folks probably don't know is an MRI's superpower is it can get onto a very tiny scale, but its super weakness is that it has poor time resolution. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, so MRI and EEG are two tools that we use all the time because they have opposite strengths and weaknesses. As you said, MRI has great spatial resolution. You could see not compared to a microscope, but in a functioning human brain, you could see data on a very tight spatial scale, down to like, a millimeter. But what we're seeing functionally is a blood flow response of the brain, which is sluggish. It takes place over seconds, as opposed to brain activity, which takes place over milliseconds. And so with EEG, we're recording electrical signatures of the brain, not the blood flow. And so we see events as they're occurring in real time. It basically goes through the scalp with no time delay, but it spreads spatially. So you can't see exactly where it's coming from.
Well, it's occluded by the scalp.
Yeah, I mean, it comes through, but it gets diffused. It's like a filter. And so it doesn't change the timing, but it changes your ability to localize where it's coming from.
It blurs.
It blurs in space. And so basically, we use fMRI to understand where activity is taking place and EEG to understand when. So we use them both as tools to give a more comprehensive picture of how the brain works and how it goes wrong and how it is improved by our interventions.
But they couldn't be used simultaneously, right? Because the MRI, the magnets in the MRI would...
We actually do it
you can
simultaneously. Do it. It's very challenging. They induce artifacts in each other, and they're on such different timescales.
People don't end up getting hurled across the room because of the magnetic...
No. We put all sorts of things inside MRI scanners, EEGs. We have joysticks that go inside MRI scanners so you could play video games.
That's wild. So people are playing Neuro Racer and other games inside that machine. Now, the EEG, because most people probably don't know this, that is kind of like a bathing cap with a bunch of sensors on it.
Modern EEGs, like we use, the data is collected with a cap that looks like a bathing cap that has many electrodes. Usually we have 64, sometimes more. And we have amplifiers at each electrode, so we could really have a sensitive detector of what's a very subtle signatures, the electrical metrics that are generated by your brain activity. There's a whole frequency spectrum, and we have drawn in many ways arbitrary lines between them.
Yes, you need a boundary somewhere.
To say alpha, delta, theta, gamma, those are the ones you hear, and they're just different frequencies along the spectrum.
But they obviously come in a diversity of flavors because you focused on midline frontal theta or frontal midline theta, whichever one it is, which is different from other forms of theta. And then finally, there's TACs and other transcranial stimulation, which is kind of funky stuff.
Well, TMS has been used a long time. TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. You could use a very high-powered magnetic field to induce an electrical current inside the brain, which causes neurons to fire.
So you're kind of giving it a flick, in a sense. You're thwacking the brain.
Flicking the brain,
it's like poking the brain.
If you stimulate over your left motor cortex, your right finger will jump, regardless of your desire. We used TMS for many years to understand the brain. There are also clinical tools for treatment of depression and other conditions that use TMS. We were very attracted to the idea of TACS and TDCS. TACS stands for transcranial alternating current stimulation. TDCS is transcranial direct current. And so what it is, it's electrical stimulation of the brain.
As opposed to magnetic.
It's safer.
So it's akin to TMS, but it's using electricity instead of magnetic fields.
It's using electricity directly.
Why is it safer? Is it gentler in some manner?
It is.
It's less of a thwack.
It's not actually causing neurons to fire. It's changing what we call the resting membrane depolarization, the bath of ions surrounding your neurons. So basically what that means is that it's just making it more likely for the neurons to fire, but not actually causing them to fire.
It's putting them in a state in which they're more inclined to do so on their own.
Exactly.
And inevitably a higher percentage of them will, as opposed to shoving them.
Exactly.
It's tempting them to fire rather than forcing them.
Yeah, they're much more susceptible to firing when engaged, and that's why we were attracted to the idea of using non-invasive brain stimulation, like the two methods I told you, to enhance plasticity while someone's playing one of our games. So we wouldn't just do it and say, come back in a month. Our approach is to use it as an enhancing effect on what we're finding with the games alone.
Enhancing plasticity. So if you zap somebody with TACs, you call it TACs or TACS?
TACS.
So you would then actually trigger that. You would put the brain into a more likely to fire state in a narrow geographic area, I assume, or the whole damn brain?
No. TMS you could target a lot more precisely, down to like the size of a dime. TACS, the electrical stimulation, is more broad, but you could target like the front left part of the brain.
But a pretty big neighborhood.
It's pretty big.
So you'll hit that button to make somebody more neuroplastic at a certain moment in the game?
Yeah, we usually do it
or throughout the game.
Throughout the gameplay.
So it's not surgical. It's more of a broad tool. But you would basically say, if we hit this person with a frequency that is akin to this theta wave that we're trying to trigger while they're playing the game, there was a hypothesis that the neuroplasticity would stick more or be more powerful.
Exactly.
And has that been borne out, or is that something still under research?
We just published a paper last week showing that 20-year-olds that play Neuroracer, while we stimulate the front part of their brain with a theta frequency, learn more rapidly than those that we don't do that for.
And is that the first definitive proof you've gotten of this?
Well, other people and other scientists have shown similar things for other abilities, but we were really excited about it because it now was enough evidence to lead us to go to the next step, which is to ask the question, if older adults played Neuroracer, like we did in our Nature paper, with brain stimulation, would they not just get better at the game, would they have more transfer?
Right, to other skills, yeah.
And would they last longer?
So that's the next study, do you think?
We're doing that now.
You're doing that now?
That study's underway.
Fantastic.
We started that study a couple months ago.
When are you going to have the results? I'm already fascinated.
Over a year to do that study. There are 4 different groups, and it's a big one.
Yeah.
But we think it's really important because it really advances this whole field of therapeutics to the next level to start thinking about combined approaches. So now someone, let's say they have a traumatic brain injury. They come into a clinic, they get a set of diagnostics, they get a game or a set of games that's targeting their cognitive limitations to optimize those abilities. And then we stimulate their brain during the process so that they can have effective and sustained recovery. We don't have anything like that right now. I mean, it's a tragedy.
Yeah. I want to talk about the post-Neuroracer landscape, but first, I want to spend just another moment on these 3 tools. Are those things improving in a rapid and compounding way, as so many things are in technology, on their own sort of Moore's Law-like curve, or are they improving slowly, or are they stagnant? If we look forward 5-10 years, can we anticipate MRIs that are so much more powerful or EEGs that are so much more powerful that we'll be able to peer into corners we can't even access now? Or is this more like, it's kind of more like airplanes? They get a little bit better over time, but not crazy better.
MRI has not improved dramatically. I mean, they are getting better, but not exponentially, not like what we're seeing in the consumer technology world.
So it's inching ahead.
Yeah.
Your MRI machines are not going to be obsolete anytime soon.
No, they last long periods of time, many, many years. I would say the thing that's most innovative in this field that's advancing it is the analytical side of it. How to use new techniques in deep learning and machine learning. And on the hardware side, I'd say the consumerization of it. How do you have a high fidelity, robust EEG recording with a mobile cap, or that someone could use at home? Things like that are starting to get there, and that's really intriguing.
So post-Neuroracer, things have continued to go forward on multiple fronts since then. Let's start by talking about what's going on in the lab.
So it was very apparent to me as the director of the lab that everyone here wanted to do something along these lines. Once you watch the scientist sitting next to you, not just get a Nature paper, but do the type of work that might impact someone's life, not just report the news about how the brain works, but still do that. To be able to have both basic science contributions and what we think of as translational science, to build things that might actually help someone, it's irresistible. And so sooner or later, everyone here wanted to do things like that. And then our lab just got so big that now we became a center. And so now we're Neuroscape, which was our transformation over this last year.
So center is a big notch up.
Center's bigger because we are not just internally focused at doing our own work, but we're also very externally focused. We're service across the entire university and now even globally of helping other labs use technology in the way we do. We're not just a research lab, which is another reason we became a center. We have an entire technology development team. So we have an interactive media director. We build our own games. We are interested not just in video games, although that remains our core, but all the other types of technology that satellite around them. So virtual reality, augmented reality, motion capture, physiological devices that are wearables. How do all of this technology, most of it entertainment directed or communication media, right, in the consumer space, how do we take it into our center and develop in a customized way to use these tools to improve brain function? And so our transformation into Neuroscape, what we say is bridging technology and neuroscience for these positive benefits. But what we spend most of our time on is building video games.
So let's talk about some of the games that are in the lab now and what muscles they're trying to build and flex and what the gameplay is like and so forth.
So Body Brain Trainer, also known as BBT, is a game that targets both physical and cognitive fitness at the same time. The hypothesis is that if you play a game that you're embodied in and is not just your eyeballs and fingers, but your whole body, you will have more benefits cognitively than if you play that same game on a tablet.
Because you're moving your whole body through space, so you're using far more networks in your brain.
You're using more networks,
yeah.
and you also have the physical fitness benefits. There's data that shows that physical fitness, even independent of cognitive challenge, has benefits on brain health through things like BDNF, which is a growth factor, and neurogenesis in the brain. So you have the combined physical fitness and cognitive fitness. That hasn't really been done yet.
And this is a VR game, correct?
No, this is a motion capture game.
This is motion capture,
So
yeah.
we probably will build a VR version, but right now Body Brain Trainer is played using the Kinect.
Right, yeah.
So you stand in front of a big screen, your body is being tracked using a consumer device that's part of the Microsoft Xbox One gaming system. So we always favor those types of devices because we don't want this to be an ivory tower experiment in a lab. We want this to be something that someone could do at home that's accessible. And so you play it. Now, what makes BBT really unique is a couple things. First of all, it's really interesting to be cognitively and physically challenged at the same time. Few people really reach that level. I'd say like professional athletes and dancers and people that drive themselves along both of those axes. But it's hard to do them both at the same time. What's cool here is that the game mechanics drive you just to accomplish one goal, both physically and cognitively. But what makes BBT most unique is that in addition to the game being adaptive in its cognitive dimensions, meaning that as you focus better and are faster and more accurate, the cognitive challenges increase, which is true of all our games.
Adaptive, therefore, is kind of a byword for it gets harder.
It gets harder relative to you getting better every single second. That is the common mechanic across all of our games. That's like our special sauce. That's what we really pride ourselves on, is creating these adaptive algorithms so that the game is incredibly personalized to you in the moment.
So there's no relaxing until the end of level 6.
No, well, we have to bring on breaks pretty frequently because it is like interval training. Even just cognitively alone, it's like interval training. You will fatigue and need to be restored. But what makes BBT unique is that we have the cognitive adaptivity, but you also wear a heart rate monitor when you play BBT. And so what we do before you play BBT is we use a tool called the VO2 Max, which is the industry standard to find out at what heart rate you as an individual should be challenging yourself to get maximal physical fitness benefit. So when you're playing BBT, you're getting the cognitive challenge. It's adaptive, so it's getting harder as you get better, but we're recording your heart rate during gameplay. So if your heart rate is below goal, let's say it's 100 beats per minute and we want it 120 to 140, the game will know that in real time and increase the amplitude of the movements that are required to play the game, driving your heart rate up. If your heart rate goes too high, the game detects that and pulls back. And so that's an example of how we use adaptive algorithms across both physical and cognitive domains to personalize it to you.
So you're always on the cusp of just detonating, but never quite getting there.
You're always pushed right to the limit that you're not so frustrated that you walk away,
that you're annoyed,
and that you're not so bored. That is the really critical element of all of our game development. And it's interesting because consumer games don't really develop adaptivity at that level. You level up in the game, but it might take days. On day one, it might just be too hard and you hate the game. Our games are always figuring out where you are in the moment and giving you a personalized experience just to make it maximally fun. And we believe to maximally harness the brain's plasticity.
Now, another software experience that you guys are developing here has to do with meditation. Let's talk about MetaTrain for a moment.
Yeah, so MetaTrain is a tablet game. It's not as gamified as most. It uses the principles of concentrative meditation and integrates them with our mechanics of adaptivity and feedback. And so how you play MetaTrain is you take the tablet, you first go through a whole sequence of instructions where our partner in crime here, Jack Kornfield, who's a mindfulness expert, teaches you of what it means to focus on your breath, to be aware of your mind wandering and to return your attention to your breath. So very traditional, ancient practices of mindfulness that you engage in. But what we ask you to do in MetaTrain is just to do it for 10 seconds. Not to try to do it for an hour and fail and not know if you're doing it well or not, but just 10 seconds. And you could play the game with your eyes closed. At the end of 10 seconds, you hear a chime, and you're cued to either press the tablet anywhere with your right thumb if you were successful, if you held your attention to your breath, or with your left thumb if you didn't, if your mind wandered.
So you're on the honor system, so to speak.
Yeah, you have no reason to do it if you're not trying to figure out how your own brain works and improve it. But yeah, it requires introspection. We're working on an EEG version that you won't have to do that.
I was about to ask.
We're not quite there yet. No one's ever done that.
Really?
Yes, no one's ever done that.
Do you even know what you'd want to track?
We have ideas. It's just very subtle. A distraction event that occurs when you're focusing on your breath is pretty subtle in your brain.
Hard to detect with the EEG.
It's hard to detect with EEG,
Yeah.
which is not a very sensitive measure in the first place, given that there's a lot of noise in the brain.
Yeah.
But to get back to the mechanics, so if you said yes, I was successful, I held my attention on my breath for 10 seconds and it didn't wander, then on your next session, you would have more time. If you said no, my mind wandered, then you would have less time. And so over the course of a half an hour, the game is titrating how long you can go with focusing on your breath. So the average person, non-meditator, that comes into this lab to play this game, how long do you think that they are able to successfully hold their breath after 30 minutes of querying?
Again, going by the honor system, so sort of self-reported in their own perception of it. Gosh, they come in and you're starting them at 10 seconds, you said? So over 30 minutes, how much would they improve if they're starting at 10 seconds? Do they generally succeed at 10 seconds? Is that like a bunny slope, like everybody does 10 seconds? Or is 10 seconds a challenge for your typical person?
On average, most people finish and they threshold between like 10 and 15 seconds.
At the end of a half hour of training?
Yeah, that's where it thresholds
Okay,
them.
got
They
it,
might
yeah.
go up, they drop back down. That's where they are.
But it's pretty short.
It's very short.
Yeah.
It's less than 20 seconds.
These are the novices on day one.
Novices on day one.
Yeah.
After 6 weeks of playing Metatrain, most people are over 2 minutes. Some people over 3 minutes.
And that's daily for a half hour?
It's 5 times a week. It starts 20 minutes, then goes 25, and then 30 minutes as you move from every 2-week period. So it eases you in. And you get feedback every day. You see a graph of how long you've achieved. Now the question, and that's what we're studying in the lab, is what is the impact of that on your cognition, on your stress, on your brain activity? And we have data that's unpublished, so I won't go into it in great detail here. We still have to put this story together, write the paper, get it peer-reviewed. But what we are already seeing in 20-year-olds is that playing Metatrain for 6 weeks can improve working memory abilities, holding information in mind, which is amazing because that's not what we're studying, but it is an internal attention process. And we're even seeing volumetric changes on MRI in the frontal cortex of 20-year-olds playing Metatrain.
Wow.
So some of this we've seen with real-world meditation practices. You could see it on an app that doesn't have a practitioner training you in front of the room is really exciting.
And again, you have this replicability
Yeah,
and this measurability. Meditation itself is an experience. You have introduced a game-like mechanic and almost like quote-unquote scoring system that allows you to do dosage and
Exactly.
replication and standardization.
There's that, and then there's the accessibility.
It's all played on an iPad.
Since it's played on an iPad, we could distribute this game mobily. We could distribute this game globally, right? And we actually just are completing a study now of foster care children in India that have played Metatrain to improve their attention abilities. Just a clear indication of you can't get doctors everywhere in this world
No.
of teachers, but pretty much everyone's going to have a mobile. It will be ubiquitous.
It will be in a period of years.
Yeah.
These 20-year-olds that you gave this test to, or you carried out this experiment with, do they have like a battery of neuropsych tests coming in and then another battery at the end to
Yeah.
see where the improvements have been? and
Same
so
methodology that we described with the Nature paper. We do a deeper dive now. Now we have older adults, again, healthy individuals above 60, playing Metatrain that are in trial right now at Neuroscape. And we, before and after they play, they get an MRI scan. We do structural imaging, functional imaging. They get EEG. They do cognitive testing. They do stress testing. They take a device home to do sleep monitoring. We do blood work to look at telomere length and hormone levels and inflammatory markers. If we believe that it could be changed by this experience, we record it before and after.
That is a huge battery of measurements that you're taking. That's before and after pretty much all of your games.
It's getting there, yeah.
And what would that battery of tests cost at retail just to get all those telomere measures? And
I mean, it's just not accessible. I mean, even an MRI scan, everyone's getting 2 MRIs, one before, one after. So
and those probably are many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know of anyone that's done this deep of a dive into any intervention's outcomes. And for us, it's still step one. It's to say, is there a signal here? Is there a mechanism of action? And does this warrant the game leaving the lab, going out into the world of industry and companies, and then going to the next level of validation where they're shown to actually have clinical efficacy.
Which would be the world of the FDA. So let's talk about your company.
So I was really motivated to not have the NeuroRacer story end with a Nature paper. I mean, that was a good outcome, as good as it gets for a scientific outcome. But my real hope was that it would leave the laboratory and actually enter people's lives. And one thing I realized that was not subtle was that you can't, I would challenge anyone to build a true product inside an academic research lab or center. We're just not built to scale in that way. We don't have customer support here, and we can't keep up with operating systems as they change. It's just not what we do. We can build a prototype and do the type of feasibility and mechanistic studies that I've described to you. But I believe that if you want it to get into people's lives, you need to figure out this delicate relationship between academics and industry. And so to do that, instead of just passing it off somewhere else to get it developed to the next level, I decided that the best idea would be to start a company. And I found amazing partners, a group in Boston called PureTech Venture that helps incubate healthcare companies, and my friends like Matt Omernick, who works at Lucas Arts at the time and was a video game professional of the highest caliber, to bring him in as well to create a company that was targeting our games as healthcare solutions, but with very high level respect and attention to the video game technology itself. And that was the idea behind Achille, which was the company that we started to move this technology out into clinical practice.
Now, in interest of full disclosure, I do want to note here that I am a tiny Achille investor.
We appreciate that.
Yeah, so that is an important thing for listeners to realize. I will probably say, as I have already said, virtually nothing myself about Achille. So I don't think that I'm bringing a biased picture of Achille to folks. But my wife and I both got very excited about this mission back when you started the company. So that is now duly noted. But let's talk about Achille, the company right now. When was it founded and how many people is it now?
We are hiring, so we're growing. I would imagine that we'll be around 40 by the end of this year. We are in full swing now. We just had a Series B, a very successful Series B, so we're well capitalized as we plan to bring our first product to market.
Is the amount of money that you raised in the sources that it came from public?
I believe so. It's at sort of the 40 plus million range.
Yeah.
And a lot of our investors were pharmaceutical companies.
Pfizer was a big investor.
Pfizer, correct? Amgen, Merck, Shire. These were all, interestingly enough, investors from the pharmaceutical world. And so we are Boston and Bay Area based. Our team is pretty much 50-50 located across those sites.
Oh, I hadn't realized that. I thought you were much more skewed toward Boston. So it's 50-50. Interesting.
Yeah, most of our healthcare, business development, patent, some of our analytics are on the East Coast. And here in the Bay Area, most of our creatives and game development sound designers, artists are over here. So it's a really cool, bi-coastal company. I like that aspect of it a lot.
And you started with, it's not called that, but in a sense, NeuroRacer 2.0.
Yeah, NeuroRacer became a game called EVO, which stands for Project Evolution. And EVO, at least that's our working title now. Whether or not that'll be the product title, we don't know. We've taken the game engine that was NeuroRacer, that became the foundation of our patent. And we've now built a game that uses that adaptivity that we defined in that patent that was behind NeuroRacer, but on top of that, built a ton of new technology and an amazing game. Much higher level of art, music, and story, better usability using an iPad now, better use of the cloud in many ways. So it is an amazing game, something that we could not have created here at Neuroscape.
It's being tested against a diversity of conditions, correct?
Yes. There are studies going on in conditions including post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, depression, autism, multiple sclerosis, early Alzheimer's disease. And the study that gets the most press, because it's the most dramatic outcome, is our phase 3 FDA trial to have EVO approved as a clinical treatment for children with ADHD. Mm-hmm. So a phase 3 is the trial right before approval.
Or final disapproval, yeah.
It's the final one in the pathway to prescribable treatment. And so we will have the data from that study. It's a multi-site study. The principal investigators at Duke and did a lot of the drug work in ADHD. And if approved, if we hit our outcomes as our pilot data would suggest.
When you say pilot data, you're not referring to NeuroRacer, you're referring to the
Evo.
phase 1, phase 2.
Yes, exactly.
The preliminary Achilles-based things. Yeah.
The preliminary trials in children with ADHD would suggest that we will reach our outcomes, but now we will await anxiously the final data that's all blinded right now. And if successful, it will be the first non-drug treatment for ADHD that's prescribable and the first prescribable video game.
I'm pretty sure I had a prescription for Pac-Man when I was a kid, but maybe that's just invented memory. And so you'll find out about this from the FDA. You'll get the data.
We'll get the data and then obviously submit it to the FDA for approval. But that's the pathway we're on. And, look, I'm very optimistic because we've seen great pilot data and I think that the hypothesis is strong. But the reality is that, if not, we will try again. We'll reformulate. The goal is to produce something that we are convinced works, that physicians will be convinced.
And that the FDA is convinced. That's very important. Yeah.
That the FDA is convinced and that insurance companies are convinced. There's a lot of people to convince. So it's the pathway to get there that a doctor would pull out a prescription pad and write 1 month of iPad training on Evo as opposed to Adderall. That's a big deal.
Since the original work on NeuroRacer was with older adults, dealing with the sorts of cognitive deficits that could eventually lead to dementia, why did you end up prioritizing ADHD for Achilles' first product? Because that's more typically first diagnosed and treated in childhood, right?
We have a lot of work on older adults too. So we haven't abandoned that pathway. It's an incredibly important one to us. But our analysis at the time led us to believe that as a business decision, this was the right population to study because the need for non-drug treatments for ADHD are so high. Parents are so inclined to find an alternative to putting their kids on drugs. And you know what? Most of these kids are playing video games anyway.
They sure are.
So it's also a market that was very receptive to it and, comfortable with it. And the need was there. And so it made sense that this would be our first target.
So where do you see digital medicine in 10 years?
The system we have now is that at Neuroscape, we're essentially incubators, right? I come up with an idea of a game that's targeting a certain neural system. We build out a prototype. We do these deep research dives. We file patents behind them so they're protectable, so they're attractive to companies. We then do these large-scale trials, try to move them into FDA approval. That's like the pipeline that we've created here. If successful, we would expect that there will be treatments across multiple conditions. We would expect that in the future that there are multiple games that are working together. I don't want us to build silos around every game like we've done with drugs and pharmaceuticals, but rather to think about how they work together. They'll be personalized. Sometimes they'll be prescribed along with a drug. What I imagine will be a drug at a much lower dose and a lower side effect profile. They might be prescribed along with brain stimulation. We will have complex adaptive algorithms that don't just record your performance and feed that into the game engine as we currently do, but record your eye movements, your heart rate, your autonomic responses. We're even working on recording brain activity during gameplay through a technology we have called the glass brain, and then feeding that data into the game engine. So in the future, we see these multiple closed loops going on that the game software is essentially understanding you in a very deep way because of all the metrics that are being recorded from you. And that data in real time is being used to create this really immersive, engaging experience that is activating your brain selectively. And then through the adaptive algorithms, what we call the closed loop, is applying pressure to that system to change it over time. And so we will have very powerful tools to help improve all of these conditions of the mind, whether it's a deficit in your attention or your mood or your memory or your perception or your decision making. And ultimately, I think that we will reach beyond medicine and improve these abilities in everyone.
Yeah, I was going to ask whether there would be an enhancement, not just fixing things that are broken.
We're very interested in that. We have an education program now that we've launched earlier this year to see if these exact same approaches that we have designed to target deficits and improve people who are suffering to just improve everyone. So we're in middle school now to try to optimize these abilities. So we think that this will be a new and important part of education and medicine.
the model of consciousness that's represented in After On sprang fairly directly from conversations that you and I had before I started writing it. And I'd like to focus on one thing, which I find fascinating in your theory of consciousness, and I did end up putting into the novels, a neuroscientist who just happens to be from UCSF, as it turns out, but it's a woman, so it's not you, tells a character with a cataplectic disorder the following things about goals. And so they're sitting in her apartment. She says, I doubt you're even registering 1% of your sensory input. You're heating the part of your field of view that I'm occupying, plus the sound of my voice, but you're blotting out everything else. Because your goal of conversing is shaping your sensory experience. It's drastically amplifying the tiny subset of signals connected to our words and negating everything else. Goals are basically cognitive actors. You could almost say they make us conscious. I'd like to talk about the significance of goals in your own understanding of consciousness and human cognition, broadly speaking.
There are two ways that we interact with the world around us. One is what we call top-down. It's how you perceive the world and attend to the world driven by your goals. You're paying attention to my voice now because you choose to. You made that decision. And that is a very human act in many ways. We are drenched deeply in top-down experiences, especially in the modern world.
The top being the kind of imaginary person in the control tower,
exactly,
who's saying this is important and that is not. The goal-generating entity,
of your identity, right. The other aspect of how we interact with the world is much more ancient and also equally important in many ways, and that's called bottom-up. That's how we attend to the world based on the environment itself, not our goals. So if there's a flash of light, a loud sound, even your name, which has now been deeply programmed into your brain, even if your name is said quietly behind you, it will command your attention independent of your goals. We are constantly navigating the world through this interface of top-down and bottom-up. My theory of consciousness is built around the idea that it is in this space between top-down and bottom-up that consciousness really emerges. That if you are only a receptacle to influences from the environment, as other animals are. Now, there are animals that also have top-down goals too and have at least some version of what we think of as consciousness. But if you go to single-celled animals at an extreme or animals that are really almost completely reflexively responsive to the environment, then I would say that they don't have consciousness at that level. Likewise, and we don't really have examples of this, but if you're completely top-down and have no sensory input, again, you cannot emerge consciousness because you don't have an experience of the world around you, which only comes through sensory input. So that's where I find that concept of consciousness emerging, at least in my own understanding of this interface of top-down and bottom-up.
One final thing. I know you read a fair amount of science fiction. Are there any works of science fiction, whether written or film or TV or some other form, that was particularly inspiring to you as a kid in your choice to go into the sciences? And are there any works of science fiction that you think do a particularly good job of exploring the field that you are scientifically active in?
Well, I would say I'm probably not alone in this, being really inspired by Isaac Asimov. His Foundation series was mind-blowing to me. And, there's actually EEG in there.
Is there in Foundation?
Yeah.
I got to go back and read it.
The second Foundation. And it's really interesting to read it again years later. I try to read science fiction every single day. The news has sort of preoccupied me a little bit and stolen me away from science fiction, which is sort of pissing me off. But
it also pisses off the science fiction writers of America, I'll tell you.
I still try to not read the news as much as read science fiction. And the reason why is because I like challenging my imagination and thinking about the future and then bringing aspects of that I think are tenable immediately into our lab and into our research practice.
Superb. Well, thank you, Adam, for being so generous with your time and for inviting us to your lab.
Thanks for coming by. It's been a fun time discussing this with you.
Okay, we are now pivoting from the summer of 2017 to the fall of 2018. Before I do that, I'd like to echo something that I said during the earlier section, which is to acknowledge that I am a tiny investor in the Boston-based company that's productizing Adam's research called Achille. Adam and I will discuss Achille in this upcoming section, and though I feel full confidence that my status as a small investor did not influence the thrust of my questions. We don't always know ourselves as well as we would like. So it's appropriate that I make you aware of this investor status for a second time. Now, on to the more recent interview. So Adam, thanks so much for joining us here, maybe 15 or 16 months after our original interview.
My pleasure. Happy to talk to you again.
So much has happened in the world and your lab and your company as well. And speaking of your company, I thought maybe we'd start by talking about that. When we sat down, I believe it was July of 2017, you had done almost all of your data generating research, but the data had not yet come back to you. And so it wasn't quite clear what that data was going to say. Now you have gotten that data back, and let's talk about it.
Yeah, so what we're referring to here is a phase 3 trial. That's the type of research study that you do to prepare a data submission to the FDA to get approval, either of a medical drug or a device. And these studies are designed as multi-site, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trials. So they have that highest level of rigor, and they're prospective studies. So you declare all of your outcomes before. It's sort of like a baseball player pointing into the bleachers and calling their home run before they hit it. The ultimate statistical challenge is to anticipate what you're going to find. So we had pre-submitted these outcomes to the FDA. This is a trial on children with ADHD that we recruited from around the country. And then we performed the study, and it took almost a couple years. We have well over 300 children involved in the study across these two different arms. They played the video game for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 4 weeks. That's what a dose of this treatment was. And they had measures that assessed their attention beforehand and after. And then there was another group playing a different game that we didn't think would have a similar benefit on their attention, but the participants had matched expectations that it would.
So that was the control group.
That's the control group. And it's a placebo control group because we're controlling for expectations of benefits, which really drives the placebo effect. And so what we found that they improved their attention ability. It's a very important test of sustained attention, of vigilance. And this test is actually a diagnostic assessment, FDA approved, for ADHD in children. This test it's this really boring exam that you sit in front of a computer screen in a dark room with just one flashing white light that usually comes up in one position and every once in a while comes up in a different position. And when it does, you have to press the button as quickly as possible. So it's pretty intolerable for anyone because it's incredibly boring, but especially if you're a child with ADHD. They perform very poorly on this test in general. And what we showed was that the group of children that had engaged in our video game treatment for a month significantly improved their ability on this particular test of attention, which is very different from gameplay. So that's why we're so excited about it. It's a transfer of attention abilities from one context to a very different one, and one that much more closely mimics how a lot of children feel about their classroom experience, that it's not engaging and having the rewards that they used to in their entertainment worlds. We've now submitted that to the FDA. That was our primary outcome that we called before we did the study as evidence to generate approval for this to be a medical device to treat in children that are diagnosed with ADHD.
And how did the numbers, the rate of improvement, compare to what people see with things like Adderall and other medical treatments?
In the domain that we're testing as our primary outcome measure, it's comparable to what we're seeing with stimulants, obviously with much less side effects. Where we didn't reach the same type of outcomes was in some of the subjective measures of behavioral change. There's a lot of questions we have about the suitability of the type of outcome measures that are used in stimulant studies, these behavioral measures, which are subjective. They're more geared at the hyperactivity associated with ADHD. So one of our future goals are to come up with better real-world behavioral metrics that target, hopefully in a quantifiable way, not subjective, the attention improvements that we're seeing with our assessments.
So when you say subjective behavioral change, what is it, parents or teachers who are seeing these kids who say, yes, they're being much less disruptive?
In this case, it's parents, but sometimes they're both done with parents and teachers. We're super excited about this study. We think that it is the data needed to have a treatment with virtually no side effects. Our main side effect was frustration from our participants because the game does push you a lot. But compared to the only other FDA-approved treatment of stimulants, which has a long list of side effects, we think that something that does have now noted improvements in attention abilities with minimal side effects does make for a really attractive treatment option for parents and children with ADHD. But there's a lot of other really interesting things that are on our list to study. For example, what is the minimal viable dose? We studied a month, but maybe some children can be helped with less, and we're going to explore that. How often do we have to redose? Do we have to redose at all? Might some children never reach the diagnostic criteria for ADHD again, or maybe they will in 3 months? We're going to be exploring this as well. And then there's the very interesting question of how does this treatment relate with the pharmaceutical treatments that are the status quo? Can we give drugs at a much lower level, avoid the side effects, use it as an activator of these different networks, and then use our closed-loop video game treatment as a more selective improvement and maybe get a synergistic effect across both of them?
When I think about all the side effects that typically get listed when you see a TV commercial for a drug, or if you are brave enough to actually read the package, they go on for acres, it seems, acres and acres in fine print of side effects. And if I ever saw something that said side effects, frustration, period, I'd laugh, and I'd also feel fairly safe taking that medication.
I know, it almost sounds like a Saturday Night Live skit a little bit.
It does.
And you also have to remember most of our participants and most of the patients will be playing video games also. So in some ways, it's a replacement therapy of the digital activities that they're already engaged in. But we did have a dropout for frustration. We know it is part of the experience. It's similar frustrations that anyone would feel trying to learn how to play piano or going to the gym to start a physical fitness training program. You really do have to push the system in order to change it.
It's by design.
Exactly. We try to counter it with really fun, immersive game elements, and there's lots of music, and now we're creating better storylines, and it makes the frustration tolerable, but you need to put pressure on the system.
Well, if you only had one kid drop out of, what did you say, over 300 people?
Yep, 350, yeah.
That's not terrible. Another big thing that Achille did is it raised, just looking from the press releases, $68 million in the last several months, so congratulations on that.
Thank you. The goal is now to go to market with this. We're obviously waiting for the FDA approval, but going to market with an entirely new category of medicine, this digital medicine, demands a lot of resources, and so thus the raise.
What is the process like when you get this far along? You've done phase 3, and now you're waiting for the FDA.
Yeah, you submit a colossal application, and then you go back and forth, just like with any review process, whether it be a scientific publication or a grant. And you go back and forth and you work it out. Do you need to change the details of the indication? Is more research needed? We're encouraged by the process so far. We're not completely through it, but we are optimistic.
So it is a bit of a dialogue then. That's interesting. I hadn't realized that. So if it does get approved, it will be the world's first prescription video game. And then what is in the pipeline for Achille beyond that? With NeuroRacer, the first game that you developed in the lab, you really squared that off against dementia. Do you have any dementia-related work going on at Achille right now, either with this game or with other games?
This particular game, and sometimes the different versions of it, it's at least a dozen clinical trials. Populations as diverse as early dementia, early Parkinson's disease, lots of great work in multiple sclerosis and depression that's pretty far along.
Wow.
And other conditions, traumatic brain injury, and more all the time. In addition to that, Achille has now licensed the second patent that I filed here at UCSF on a game that involves both physical fitness and cognitive fitness training integrated into one game environment. We think that there will be a synergistic effect. Our data is starting to convince us, but Achille has been excited by what we've worked on over the last 5 years with this technology, and so they've just licensed it from UCSF, who owns that patent, and they're now going to take it through a similar high-level tech development pathway, as well as a very broad but deep research dive to figure out its benefits as another type of digital medicine.
What's the name of the game again?
Body Brain Trainer.
Body Brain Trainer, yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of just an internal working name for us to describe the main elements of it, which are challenging across both the physical and cognitive domains simultaneously in an integrated way.
I'm not surprised that you don't remember every detail of our conversation of 16 months ago. We did talk about the brain body game then, and you made the point in the main body of the interview just a half hour ago, or whenever it was, that really, unless you're a world-class athlete, like Olympic or professional level, you're probably never pushing both your cognitive and your physical to the edge. I'd never really thought about that until we'd had the first conversation. It's intriguing that this is something that'll be possible. When I tested it a couple of years ago, it was Kinect-based in the lab. Have you moved it to VR or AR?
We have some other games that involve physical movements that have some of the same fitness challenges that are now in VR. Body Brain Trainer, this particular game, is still a Kinect motion capture. But for example, today we were playing our newest game that we're very excited about called Coherence, which is a virtual reality rhythm, full body motion capture game designed to challenge you rhythmically at the highest level, in addition to full physical fitness challenges to improve cognitive function broadly. We are doing a lot of our motion capture coupled with more immersive sensory experiences that can be supplied through virtual reality.
So there's more and more VR in the lab in general.
Much more VR. And as we move forward, we're interested in not just visual and auditory, but this game will have tactile. You'll experience vibrationally the different rhythms you're exposed to. And then in some other very early work, we're even looking at scent stimulation and olfactories.
So do you wear a haptic vest or something like that with this game?
Yes, that's what we're looking at now.
And the goal with this game is general cognitive improvement. Is it focused on something very specific, like NeuroRacer's focused on distraction, or is it an all-around mental wellness therapy?
Well, rhythm is its fundamental elements, anticipation of events, as well as precise timing. If someone's rhythmic, they're displaying those features. That's what it means to tap along or engage with the rhythm of music. And our brain, in general, relies on anticipation and precise timing as well. We've shown this in my own lab over the years that anticipation and timing are involved in memory and perceptual decision-making, and that when these features of brain function decline, you lose some of the performance that you were obtained earlier in life. So we think that if we could make someone more rhythmic through this experience, we'll see benefits on those abilities. What's so amazing is that no one has actually done this study yet, right? Given that music therapy and this concept of the therapeutic benefits, especially on our mind of music, no one has really done the study of we're going to take people prospectively, try to make them more rhythmic, and then understand what the benefits of becoming more rhythmic are on a whole host of cognitive abilities. We're doing that in healthy people, and where we're really excited to go are populations, like, for example, dyslexia.
You don't have an arm underway with subjects, with patients yet, do you?
No, we were actually today meeting with our development. We have an advisor, a woman, Tracy Rosenthal, who's one of the head producers of Guitar Hero and Rock Band and Dance Central.
Really?
And we work with Rob Garza from Thievery Corporation, who's actually composed original music for Coherence. And so we keep a diverse team, scientists and clinicians, as well as obviously our full game team. And now we're creating the closed loop algorithms that I think make what we do at Neuroscape as well as Achille very unique and special. How do we take what are the performance metrics that we're recording in real time that we're using to update all the many elements of the rhythmic experience in such a way that we could keep moving you to higher rhythmic states?
That's exciting. When do you expect to first start putting subjects through the laboratory experience?
In general, it takes us a couple of years to build one of these, and we're, I guess, around 9 months into Coherence. So I think we're picking up speed on our development as we get more savvy. I would hope that before 2019, we start a full study.
And that is really exciting. We'll have our check-in conversation about that next year then, maybe.
Sure.
From some email that we exchanged prior to this conversation, a lot of the studies that I was hoping might have been completed that you mentioned a year and a quarter ago are still in their final stages, but there was a little bit of an update in one of the studies. 15 months ago, you just published a study saying that young people who had TACS stimulation at the theta wave frequency improved much more rapidly at NeuroRacer. And so this was basically electrical stimulation. I know at the time you had just launched a forearm trial to see if older adults would enjoy similar improvements, but even more significantly, be able to transfer those improvements to other skills. I know that's still in process, but you said you did a replication of the first trial. Did you do that with young people again? Or did you do that with older population?
Yeah, so the replication was done again in younger adults. The field and many fields in science have been plagued by lack of replication of research. I feel like the fact that we could have people improve on a video game over the course of an hour with a stimulation to their brain with an alternating current that they can't even feel is just mind-blowing. And so we did it again, found the same results, and then we manipulated the timing of the stimulation, the breaks that we take between timing sessions, and found that that led to no improvement. So we replicated the finding, but more interestingly showed that those details about how the stimulation is delivered, where, when, all of those things determine its eventual effects.
And the stimulation parameters were primarily around timing?
Yeah, you give a period of stimulation, and then you could take a 30-second break, you could take a 5-minute break, all the time still playing the game. And you could stimulate, pause, allow that to consolidate, stimulate again, or just keep stimulating right through. There's so many potential parameters to manipulate. So all of this is accumulating evidence that the non-invasive stimulation of the brain during gameplay, if done in a certain way, which matters, can lead to improvements that we hope eventually leads to either quicker benefits or even farther reaching benefits than we've obtained with the video game alone. The closed loop video game is the core that activates the brain network in a very specific way and applies pressure to it. But if we could find ways of accelerating or enhancing those effects with techniques that are not dangerous, that are accessible, the idea is again to see if we could move this field more rapidly into the clinical domain.
Now, if I could interpret this and tell me if I'm playing this back accurately, if I imagine the home trial that's coming up, what will happen is that people will play the game with some kind of relatively inexpensive and highly portable headband or something on. Unbeknownst to them, that headband will either be giving them TACS stimulation or it will not. Some will be in the control group. They won't get stimulation. Some people will not be in the control group. They will get stimulation. And if the results hold, as you've already seen them, those who get the stimulation, it's like turbocharging their brain. They will learn from the game and get better at the game faster simply because this electrical field is surrounding their head.
And we should be able to manipulate the frequency of the stimulation and show less effects or more effects. Some people call it electroceuticals, a new type of treatment. But I'm very interested not in using this alone, but how it's coupled with the type of very selective network activation that we get from the video games. So else it's another blunt instrument in much the way that pharmaceuticals are. It's not activating networks selectively. That's something that we've only been able to selectively do with experiences like the video game experience.
And when you talk about transference, I know that that is a critical term that has a very precise meaning. Could you define what transference means?
The goal is always to show that what got better was not just the game. Ideally, things occur in someone's everyday life that could be improved. That's the highest level,
That's the transference. Like,
right.
Not only did they get better at Neural Racer, which is great, but not a very important life skill, but they got much better at not forgetting where they put the keys.
Exactly. That's what we want, right? That's why we do it in the first place. Usually there's an intermediate step where we can't have thousands of people and look for these very subtle signals and subjective signals, like how many things do you remember on your shopping list. So we look for a signal that there is transfer by using outcome measures that we do before and after, like I described on the ADHD study. So there we're seeing transfer from the engagement that you have with the game to a very different context of attentional deployment like you do in that sustained attention task. Now, the next step is to show that it even goes further into how they read, let's say, at home or in a classroom. And we'll need much larger numbers because those metrics are not as quantitative.
Yeah, and transference is really vital because people are going to be strengthening certain mental muscles and obtaining certain important skills in a very artificial environment, in a gaming environment. And unless they can transfer that to their daily life, then there really isn't much benefit.
Obviously, it needs to have improvement that exceeds a placebo group. But yes, This concept of transfer is more specific, say, experiential treatments like ours, where you're engaged in a certain type of interactivity. That could be a meditation class. It doesn't have to be digital. I mean, even a classroom education is a type of experiential treatment in very similar way. A child goes into a class and engages in a type of interactivity that's supposed to improve how their brains function. And then hopefully that transfers to their future and their real life. All systems that have experiential treatments really struggle with this concept of transference. Even going to the gym, physical fitness, does it really benefit you in your daily life? Does it benefit your health? Does it benefit your cardiovascular status? And also sustainability of benefits. We don't expect things to last forever, but we do want to understand how fleeting the benefits are. If they're gone in a day or two, that's not great, right? We want to have some sustainability so we don't have to constantly engage in it. Although if you take the physical fitness example, you can't just stop and expect it to last all that long.
I would imagine most of these things will prove to be more like physical training than surgery, where hopefully surgery is a one-off. Although I've had a certain minor ankle surgery 3 times, so maybe surgery is sometimes a periodic thing.
It is sometimes a chronic thing. And one of the other aspects I find interesting about this is that sometimes a participant will get a benefit from one of our video game treatments, and then they show sustained benefits months, even we're seeing now years later. And it might not be just because of the changes that occurred due to that 1-month treatment, but because their cognitive function is somehow different after the fact, they now interact with the world around them in a way that helps maintain those benefits. Like it would be similar if you went to the gym for a year and a half and you got all these physical fitness benefits, and then your gym closed, so you started taking the stairs and walking to work, and you find other ways, even outside of your awareness, of engaging in the natural world that helps maintain the benefits that you had already achieved.
Yeah, the greater strength that you have enables a new set of activities. So using the gym example, yeah, you might start walking to work a lot more. If you got greater mental acuity from one of your games, you might suddenly become a Sudoku aficionado, whereas you never would have contemplated it before.
You might even just be engaging in group interactions differently. These things cascade in very complex ways. Actually, one of the things I'm quite interested in is using behavioral interventions on top of our cognitive tools to help have better transfer and better maintenance of these effects by encouraging using these new abilities in a real-world manner.
It's sort of reminding me what some of the happiness researchers are doing. I quite recently had a guest on the show, Laurie Santos, who's an evolutionary psychologist at Yale, who just taught this very, very popular class on the science and the practice of happiness at Yale. And she very strongly made the analogy it's much more like going to the gym than getting a one-off procedure. But she also mentioned that there are these cascading effects, and they can be very, very synergistic with one another, and or they can be synergistic with really subtle lifestyle changes that end up sustaining happiness.
Yeah, this is definitely the direction I'm interested in going. It's going to take us a lot more work. We're not done figuring out how to use digital technology to improve brain function, but having higher level brain function is not the end all. You have to know how to use it, sustain it, engage it in your everyday life, and that's part of the more comprehensive delivery that we'd like to offer people.
Well, thank you so much for making so much time available. I know you've got a giant trip on the horizon.
Yes.
And safe travels with that.
Thank you so much. Great talking with you.
Yeah, and man, things are moving so quickly. I'm sure I'll haunt you for another one of these at some point in the future.
I'm looking forward to it. It's fun for me to get periodic check-ins and make sure that we're advancing at the pace that we would like to. So I appreciate it myself.
So that was Adam Gazzaley, Then and Now. I hope my patrons will now join me for that fabulous interview that I mentioned up front with Avi Loeb, with new insights into Oumuamua. I hope some anti-Patreon folks will consider supporting the show via PayPal. And everybody, please do continue to spread the word via social media, taps on the shoulder, and skywriting. As the audience grows for this show, my prospects of building an ad model that I can be proud of will increase. And I think if I get to that point, the show will be a lot more sustainable. So spreading the word is a very meaningful way to back this show, as is ranking it, rating it in your favorite podcasting app, whether it's from Apple, Stitcher, or elsewhere. Thanks a lot for joining me, and I hope you'll join me next time.